Okay, let's get at least the official recording started because we can spend a minute doing that. So welcome everybody. We're going to just begin our class on the civil rights movement and the civil rights struggle. So really looking over time in American history at the struggle and movement around civil rights in our Constitution, in our society, in our laws, all these pieces. So today we're going to go through this really quickly, and we want to make sure we do three kind of big things. We have a special guest speaker on Friday called Professor Jeffries. He's an amazing professor out of Ohio State. And the three big rules that he teaches around teaching the civil rights movement is, number one, make sure you're really clear that when you talk about movements and struggling moving forward, that our students we don't walk away with the idea, all of us being students, that it's always a great movement towards progress. It might be a great movement towards progress over time, but when we really look at that arc, it's filled with a lot of forward movement and huge step backs. And Tom's going to go over that today. He's one of our top scholars at the Constitution Center. But all of that movement forward means there's a whole bunch of people constantly pushing for change and not letting up and keep going. So we'll look at all those people today. Another big thing is we love MLK. He's amazing. We celebrated on Monday. He is one of so many amazing stars in the story of the civil rights movement over time, and we want to compliment him with other people and other stories. And then finally, this is hard stuff. Let's just acknowledge it, that the civil rights movement there can be very moments at time that makes you feel very sad and horrible about our past. But there's also amazing shining stars that make you see the best of humanity and the best of America. So let's just wrap those three together and dive deep into the civil rights movement. So Tom, as we kick off class, where do you want to begin? Do you want to begin with the Declaration and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Where would you like to begin with this really amazing and important talk?
Well, I think with what you said about Dr. King, and hi everyone, good to see everyone. Let's start with some of the key groups and key figures, and then we'll get back to the founding documents and then tell American history forward, if that works.
Awesome. I love starting with the people. So tell me about the people.
Sure. And so we're gonna tick through some of the really big civil rights groups, and what you'll see is that different ones are founded at different times. So it really gives you immediately a sense that even the classic civil rights movement that we think of in the 40s, 50s, and 60s has a longer history extending decades back and decades back and decades back. And so the oldest of the organizations central to the civil rights story in the 20th century is the NAACP. So it was founded in 1909. And here we see some of the key figures: W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story. Now, just to highlight a couple, Du Bois is one of my favorite figures in this story. I mean, he's the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard. He's an historian of Reconstruction, a period that I study closely. And his book, Black Reconstruction in America, remains an absolute classic, and really for its time and projecting forward would place African Americans at the center of Reconstruction's story. Now, Mary White Ovington was a suffragist, a journalist, and also one of the co-founders of the NAACP. And Moorfield Story was a lawyer, a prominent lawyer in Boston, who would be the founding president of the organization. One person not on here is also Ida B. Wells, who also played a key role founding the NAACP. And she did this remarkable journalistic work in the 1890s and early 20th century, documenting violence against African Americans, documenting lynching. And it's a lot of what we know from that period about lynching comes from the courageous journalism of Ida B. Wells.
Awesome. Thank you for adding her. We will get her image up there as well. Now, Tom's going to walk you through these big groups. So another big group is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Sure. And so if the NAACP is most famous for eventually leading the legal strategy up to Brown versus Board of Education, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is maybe the most famous of these organizations, founded in 1957, so decades after the NAACP, and it's most closely associated with Dr. King. But if we're looking at the people on the screen, there are so many other people played a central role. We see Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth, both key ministers, close allies and friends of Dr. King. We see Bayard Rustin there on the bottom right, who was a close ally of A. Philip Randolph, and one of the real prophets of nonviolent direct action. A lot of what Dr. King learned about nonviolence, he learned from Bayard Rustin. And then on the bottom left there is a remarkable figure, Ella Baker, who was involved in the civil rights struggle for 5 decades. She was involved with the NAACP. She was involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and projecting into the 1960s, She'd play a key role in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what her role here, she's often behind the scenes working with key figures, but pushing hard for two big things. One, to make sure that the civil rights movement didn't become a national top-down organization, that it continued to be something driven by the grassroots, but that also it wasn't just an organization led by men, that women would play a key role, a central role in leadership.
And I think is really fascinating about these groups, and Tom, you're saying it as we go through, is that there's so many overlaps too. So when we think of the civil rights movement, it's all these shining stars and then the organizations connecting these dots, but they're all working together and working in certain areas of the country, across the whole country too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the Congress for Racial Equality is founded in 1942. The key figures here, you see James Farmer is a really important figure. He's one of the leaders of the Freedom Rides that we'll talk about in the early 1960s. But again, the Congress of Racial Equality, largely an organization committed to nonviolent direct action. And so George Hauser's a Methodist minister. Bernice Fisher is one of the pioneers of sit-ins as a form of protest, which again, we'll talk about as the lesson goes on.
Leadership Conference on Civil Rights.
So the Leadership Conference was founded in 1950, and its key role within the civil rights movement is it's pushing for national legislation. And so it's going to play a key role in all of the big civil rights legislation we begin to see in the 1950s, but especially into the 1960s and onward. We see Roy Wilkins here, who was involved in the NAACP, but also Leadership Conference. Arnold Aronson, who was the founding president of the Leadership Conference, and A. Philip Randolph there in the middle, one of the key early labor organizers within the African-American community, pushing for civil rights and economic equality for African Americans from the early 20th century onward. And the Leadership Conference remains just a pivotal player in civil rights all the way up to today.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to kind of see this as they're talking about civil rights and changing of the law, but they're also talking about rights in education, rights in jobs, rights in where you live. All those pieces are wrapped into this movement.
Absolutely. And so now we get to the next generation of leadership with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960. You see up there, top center, Ella Baker, who we already saw with the Christian Leadership Conference. Very active here in starting the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is exactly as the title suggests. It's a group of students. These are really, really young people fighting for change. And Ella Baker becomes a mentor to many of them. The most famous voice here, most famous face, John Lewis on the upper right there. And it's amazing as you study his biography to see he was everywhere. He was in Nashville doing sit-ins. He was, obviously on the bridge at Selma, enduring unspeakable violence, speaking at the March on Washington. He was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders, a person courageously fighting for the deepest values in our Constitution. But as we go across, I'll do a quick tick through the others. So Diane Nash was there too. She was in Nashville. She helped organize the sit-in movement. She helped with Selma. She was a central figure here in a lot of the actions taken by SNCC. And then if you go down, Julian Bond on the bottom left would go on to found the Southern Poverty Law Center. Stokely Carmichael, a key figure in the Black Power movement. Bob Moses fighting for voting rights in Mississippi. And Bernice Johnson Reagan pushing for and teaching everyone the importance and the power of song to unify the civil rights movement, to bring together people of all races around its message. And last thing about Ella Baker is she convinced this group to really focus on two big things. One, continue direct nonviolent action, but two, really focus on the vote, and make sure that's a key part of the civil rights movement story.
And that's huge in so many of these pieces. So what we're going to do really now, students, is we kind of want you to meet the people, and then we want you to see the big picture of the civil rights movement. So often when we teach this, we only focus in on the 50s and 60s. We're going to really quickly back it up for you a minute, start from the Declaration, zip through to the 1950s and 60s, and then look at the legislation that followed, the amazing work of people like this and people like John Lewis and Ella Baker and Diane Nash, and see what their work brought and how we live with it today. So let's go, Tom. Speed timeline.
All right, let's go, Kerry. So starting with the Declaration, I just want to really reinforce one key theme here, which is a theme that we see throughout American constitutional history, which is that people pushing for change, people pushing for reform, often root their visions of change in the nation's founding documents, beginning with the Declaration, but also the Constitution. And so for the civil rights movement, we see with the Declaration of Independence, the promise that all men, eventually all women, are created equal, and that we all have natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we see all the way from 1777 with Prince Hall, who was a leader of the African-American community in Massachusetts, saying, get rid of slavery, all the way to Frederick Douglass, trying to remind us that we need to live up to our nation's ideals, all the way up to the 20th century and key civil rights figures like Dr. King, rooting these arguments in the promise of the Declaration of Independence. But of course, we know it's not just the Declaration, it's the Constitution itself. The Constitution is absolutely central to the civil rights movement and the civil rights movement's story, beginning with we the people, beginning with the preamble, the very simple argument that our government is rooted in popular sovereignty and we African Americans are part of the people. We've always been part of the people and we will continue to be parts of the people. And then also the key promises written into the Constitution after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment promising freedom and equality, the 15th Amendment banning racial discrimination in voting, but really being a second American founding, this second moment where we recommit, we double down on some of our core commitments, and we write those promises into the Constitution. And this becomes important because it allows you, even when, and we'll talk about it in a second, even when we turn away from the glorious promise of these amendments, you would still have people who could lay claim to the text of the Constitution saying, what you're doing on the ground doesn't square with this. This is the law of the land. This is our highest law. We're going to take it to the courts. We're going to take it to the legislatures. We're going to take it to the American people. And we're going to change America to get America to live up to the promise that's written right here. But Kerry, that's a bit of the founding documents. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think that's great because I think, we have this promise that we start with. And Warren, great point in the chat. Don't forget the colonists and the Quakers and the Friends.
Oh, yeah,
Very
absolutely.
Good. Yeah,
yes.
Great, Warren. Like, you're right. Even before the Declaration of Independence, we have this, this bubbling up of equality. It's written out to the world in the Declaration of Independence. And then there's backwards and there's forward movements. Prince Hall is pushing and taking assemblies to Congress and saying, this is not right. Read it in Congress, this petition, and say this is not right. But again, ebbs and flows. And the entire time there's African Americans resisting and pushing for change, even when the pushback is so strong and will not be seen in generations of their lives. They're still pushing for change. We get to the Reconstruction Amendments and we get, Tom, you say it in my favorite way out of all of our scholars, we get this experiment in interracial democracy. It's almost like this bubbling up of hope around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that, hey, it's working. It's working now.
Yes, and it really did for a brief period. We had African-American governors, US senators, members of Congress, members of state legislatures, all the way down to justices of the peace and sheriffs, people leading their local communities. And you know how they got those jobs? A combination of the national government taking action and through their own votes. They were at the ballot box. They were at the ballot box participating in debates, but also by voting their choices. And so we see this period, but it's all too brief. And we see a pushback as we get, especially into the late 1870s, into the 1880s and 1890s. And this glorious moment is replaced by Jim Crow. And so what do we get with Jim Crow? We get laws on the books that keep African Americans from being able to vote. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, but of course also violence, intimidation, keeping people from the polls. It's not just the law, it's the law plus violence that's doing that. And we see the same thing when it comes to civil rights, your individual rights. We see African Americans having to take different railway cars, have their children go to different schools, use different, eventually water fountains and bathrooms and everything else. And we see this regime put in place both through law and through violence and through intimidation of second-class citizenship for African Americans throughout the South. We see some of this in the North too. It's not like the North didn't have discrimination, but we see a pervasive regime of apartheid in the South. And what Kerry has here is Plessy v. Ferguson as a reminder too that the Supreme Court green lights these laws. It says that these laws, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, less than 3 decades after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, saying that laws like that, laws that force African Americans and white people to take different railway cars, that they're constitutional. They don't violate the 14th Amendment's promise of equality. And it's a 7-1 decision. It's not even close. But the one's really important, Kerry. Can I pause for a second
Yeah.
on Justice Harlan?
Oh, please. Well, it's Justin Harlan, so sure.
Yeah, so John Marshall Harlan writes this famous dissent in Plessy. Harlan himself, from a slaveholding family in Kentucky, an opponent of the Reconstruction Amendments, but is changed by what he sees going on in the South during Reconstruction, is moved by the violence and moved to support the broad promise of the Reconstruction Amendments. And he is the lone dissenter in Plessy saying, no, Jim Crow violates the core of the Reconstruction Amendments, the core of equality written in the 14th Amendment. The Constitution, as he said, is colorblind. There is no caste here. And he makes the prediction that we'll eventually look at Plessy the same way we look at Dred Scott, as a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake made by the Supreme Court.
So steps forwards, big steps back. And Plessy's one of the biggest ones that we have this big pushback, but didn't stop Homer Plessy from pushing forward and taking this case and saying this isn't right. And then we have suppression of the vote. And then there isn't just nothing until the 1960s in the courts. The courts aren't doing a great job. And you're right, the violence in society is oppressing the vote, is oppressing the voice and agency of so many African Americans across this country, from north to south, east to west. But we also have these little glimmering moments that start to chip away at the oppression. You want to talk about the SCOTTSBORO boys, and then we'll jump to World War II?
Absolutely. So yeah, you see sort of these sprinkling of cases in the early 20th century where the court is breathing some life into the 14th Amendment and into the Constitution for African Americans. The Scottsboro Boys case is one of the most famous. It's a decision from 1932. And these are 9 African American young men accused of violence against white women. The case, the jury trial itself had all sorts of irregularities. Eventually, the jury sentences 8 of the 9 defendants to death. And the Supreme Court, there's a challenge that finds its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, no, there is actually a constitutional violation here. There was a constitutional violation. In this particular case, they had a 6th Amendment right to adequate counsel, and they didn't get it. And so again, we see it's not like that created this burst of cases protecting African Americans, but we see, at least when pushed really, really far with a lot of unfairness at trial for African Americans, the court, stepped in. We see the court step in to say in Ginn versus United States in 1915 that grandfather clauses, they're unconstitutional. So this is one of those laws that's used to keep African Americans from being able to vote. We also see in, what year was it, with Buchanan versus Worley in around 1917, also the court striking back against racial zoning laws. So laws that are in place saying that African Americans can't live here. We see the court pushing back against that, but it's very, very little in the grand scheme of the Jim Crow regime.
And really quickly, just to introduce 2 more women into this storyline before we get to World War II, and not just think of Rosa Parks as only the person in the bus, but really kind of expand her storyline, because it is a unbelievable life she lives fighting for civil rights.
Yeah, I mean, she commits her life to that. It's not as though she just, I think we've mentioned it, Kerry. It's not as though she was just a tired person on the bus that didn't want to give up her seat, which is sometimes, I think, how people learn about her story. But she's a crusader for civil rights over many, many decades. She's, I think it's in 1942, 1943. She's the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. She's a really, really active figure there. And then she unites with Recy Taylor to create this Committee of Equal Justice in the 1940s. What's its main task? What's its mission? To speak out against violence against African American women. And so it's not just, it sounds so, in a sense, modern, but Rosa Parks has such a multifaceted constitutional legacy.
She does, and it's unbelievable, because we talk about the violence towards African Americans, and we don't ever, and I know this is the advanced class, so I can expand this a little, we don't ever talk about the oppression that was used to attack African American women. And Martha Jones has written amazing books on African American women and the right to vote, but there's a lot of stories behind this, and she is one of many crusaders that are like, no, this violence is directed towards women to oppress them as well. And then it's also, when we talk about this and we unpack it, it's also directed towards veterans. So World War I and World War II, African-American veterans, Civil War, you pointed this out earlier, Tom, Civil War veterans. And, they're fighting for our country and coming home and being targets because of their uniform. So can you kind of bring this up, and then we'll jump to the 1960s, I promise everyone.
Absolutely. Remember, so like we have hundreds of thousands of African Americans fighting in World War II. They're drafted into the army just like, you know, white people in America, and they're fighting in a segregated army to fight against Hitler and Nazism. And so what's the double victory? What's the double V? What's this? It's W.B. Du Bois and other African American leaders saying, let's commit to two things during this war. Let's defeat the Nazis abroad, but let's also defeat racism at home. And so what we see with World War II, and also projecting it out forward, Kerry, to the Cold War afterwards, is the politics on the global stage, America trying to spread freedom throughout the world, places tension at home. It forces especially white moderates in America to look in the mirror and say, are we living up to our best ideals? And it's Du Bois right there and his allies saying, we're not. You have to see it. What can be more clear than, you know, why are we defeating the Nazis but not defeating racism at home?
And it's unbelievable. Like, call it, say it. And you're right. It was even during the 1950s and 1960s, that Cold War moment where the administrations, even the Kennedy administration, were saying, hey, civil rights movement, maybe you should cool down just for a little bit until we start to settle this. And it was major leaders like Bayard Rustin and others that said, we cool down anymore, we're going to be frozen. We need to move forward. It's been hundreds of years of cooling down. Enough already. So unbelievably charge and energy and movement brings us to the civil rights movement, which is a huge change in society, in laws, and in the Constitution. And that's what really, and this is a terrible word to use, but it congeals it as a movement. Movements are hard to sustain, but this struggle has gone on for hundreds of years, but this movement is focused on that time period. That's why we look at it together in this one time period. Should we begin with the NAACP legal team and look at Brown versus Board of Ed and then jump to 1960s?
Yeah, I think that's great, Kerry. And I mean, just to highlight, so where does the Constitution come in here? I mean, just to really telegraph it. I mean, a lot of these debates end up being classic debates brought to life by really vivid examples and concrete and violence. Big debates over what role does the national government have to promote civil rights, political rights, and what power do we leave to the states? And then with that, then how broadly do we read the 14th Amendment's promise of freedom and equality? How broadly do we read the 15th Amendment's promise of ending racial discrimination in voting? And furthermore, finally, what we get to when we get to the NAACP legal team is, what is the role of the courts here? The courts here, this is where the court, and we, in the title of the lesson, is the Warren Court. The Warren Court being led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the author of Brown versus Board of Education, but it's with the Warren Court and Earl Warren where we begin to see something like the modern court that we look at today. What is one of the classic reasons we say the Supreme Court has a role in our constitutional system that's important? Why do we want the Supreme Court politically insulated? It's to protect minorities. It's to protect the unpopular based on race, but the unpopular who is also, just think about all of the other constitutional rights essential to the civil rights movement: speech, assembly. Frankly, the black churches are so important. So free exercise of religion, the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the rights of the accused, the rights to a jury trial, due
Second
process,
Amendment.
all of these things. Second Amendment, of course.
Ida B. Wells again, yeah,
Yes,
and that's
of course.
We bring her into our Second Amendment lesson so much because she's saying like this is the only way African Americans can protect themselves is with this. So keep going.
Yeah. If you can't trust the local police force, it's very useful to have an individual right to keep and bear arms. That being a key argument. And so anyway, I just want to sort of highlight some of it's more than just the push towards desegregation. It's this whole broad set of constitutional values that are central to constitutional change. But let's get to the Brown. Let's get to Brown. So the legal team there was Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, William Hastie. They're all with the NAACP. And the thing, again, always to remember about Brown is it didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't just a thunderbolt from above that came from nowhere. It could teach us a lot about how constitutional change happens inside the courts, and what Marshall, Hamilton Houston, and Hastie did, and their entire team, was build up the case to Brown by chipping away at Jim Crow case by case over time. And so, we already talked about things like Ginn and the Scottsboro boys. And so the court had already shown some openness to the sorts of arguments the NAACP would make based on racial equality. But we see leading up to Brown from about the mid-1930s onward, a series of cases that chips away at Jim Crow. There's Missouri versus Gaines, which is someone who wanted to go to the University of Missouri Law School. And what Missouri said is, no, it's a white-only school. Maybe we'll give you some money to go out of state. And the Supreme Court said, that's not enough. If you don't have a law school in your state that's there for African Americans, then you have to let him in. That is not a separate but equal system. So notice the court's not overruling Plessy v. Ferguson, but it's chipping away. It's chipping away. It's recognizing more and more claims that separate is inherently unequal. And so we chip away, we go further, and then we have a couple of key cases where we have SHELLEY versus KRAEMER in 1948. And so this is, again, the court stepping in and saying that racial covenants, these are covenants that say you'll buy a house and it says you can't sell it to African Americans or people of other races. The court says those are unenforceable. Those are unenforceable. So striking away at that as well. And then finally, we see two cases in higher education dealing with segregation. We see McLaurin and Sweat v. Painter. And in each of these cases, what the Supreme Court's saying is that, you know, these particular systems here, they violate, there's discrimination against African Americans, and that they're recognizing that the 14th Amendment has real content. And so in the case of McLaurin, he was being given different facilities as he's going for his Doctor of Education degree, and they're like he had to sit in his desk outside of the classroom. He had to sit at a different table at the cafeteria. These ridiculous things. The court's like, that's not equal. How is that equal? And then Sweat v. Painter was a challenge to the Texas law school system, where they had a separate school for African Americans and a separate system, a school for whites, the University of Texas. And what the court said is, you can't look at those two things and say you're providing separate but equal opportunities for African Americans. UT is prestigious. It has a huge faculty, huge libraries, huge alumni network. This other school has very little. That's not good enough. And so this sets the stage for as we get to Brown versus Board of Education and the big question of desegregation in public schools.
Got it. So Brown versus Board of Ed, 1954, comes down separate is inherently unequal, unfair, unjust. But then it takes years to desegregate schools. So again, connect the dots between the court cases for us and then the action, and then we can fly through to some of the action taken by Congress, finally using those enforcement clauses in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
No, that's absolutely right. And so, yeah, so it's a unanimous Supreme Court in Brown. It's a decision written by Chief Justice Earl Warren. And what happens? We see massive resistance in the South. We see massive resistance. We see, 101 members of Congress signing the Southern Manifesto, attacking the court, saying that what you're doing is beyond what the court has the power to do. You see school systems not desegregating. And you see what this really, I think, draws out over and over again, Kerry, is that it's great for the Supreme Court to act. It's great to win in courts, but sometimes it takes additional action to see both the Constitution, the written text carried out in practice, but also the court's rulings. And so what this teaches the civil rights movement, and they knew it already, because it's not as though there's only a legal strategy and nothing's happening below, but it reaffirms the need for there to be big time action outside of the courts to make sure that you stir the conscience of the broader American public and you get the Southern states to actually change.
And this is amazing, because this is like, when we talk about the civil rights movement, it's this grassroots resistance movement push. And it starts with the people putting themselves in some of the most dangerous situations and being killed for it. So we're going to tick through these really quickly, but we begin with, we talked about with the Montgomery bus boycott, and then we'll show here is the action. So the court says it, nothing happens. The people take to the streets across the country and push hard.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the Rosa Parks refusing to give her seat up to a white passenger, and this is an important, famous action of nonviolent direct action. So she's saying there's a rule here that is unjust. I'm going to violate it. I'll suffer the legal consequences. But it galvanizes all sorts of activity throughout Montgomery, Alabama. A huge boycott of the bus system that lasts over a year. It's African Americans walking to work, not taking the bus, forcing their local government to change. And this is also where, Dr. King is the new pastor in town in Montgomery, and he comes to prominence as part of the Montgomery bus boycott. But this is, something that we see replicated in a lot of different ways. Should we tick through some of like the really amazing and powerful and courageous actions? Yeah, so Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. 1960, we see the student sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so here, these are courageous African Americans going to lunch counters that say African Americans can't be here. They're yelled at. People yell at them, white mobs yell at them, they pull at them, they punch them, they drag them, they're arrested, and nevertheless, they remain nonviolent. And so therefore, one, expose the injustice of the law of not being able to sit there, but also the unjustness of the people who are treating them unfairly and violently. And so this spreads to Nashville, spreads to other major cities throughout the country, including Dallas, including Baltimore. And so this is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of their main early activities. Projecting forward, in 1961, we then see the Freedom Rides. And so we've already seen the Supreme Court in multiple decisions has said segregation in interstate travel, it's unconstitutional, it's illegal, both of those things. And the Southern states have not changed. They continue to have segregated buses. And so these Freedom Riders board buses up north. It's a multiracial group of people. John Lewis, again, was one of the first original 13 Freedom Riders. And they get in the bus and they drive down south. And they don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they are so courageous because they know it's probably not going to end peacefully. And what we see is just unbelievable violence. We see buses bombed. We see people beaten at waiting stations. We see, police officers either participating or standing aside while mobs attack the Freedom Riders. And as with many of these things, we end up with powerful images of injustice that end up reshaping public opinion in important ways.
Yeah, and there's a couple really good questions in the chat that I wanted to get to around this, and it kind of sparks everybody's understanding. So we tend to say like, oh, it's the governor in the South that's the problem. And we try to like label all the bad with one person. So it makes us feel, I don't know, better about it. So Colin's question in here, and I'm going to unpack this. There's a couple questions in here. Let me go to the first one because did the South recognize, and this isn't just the South, Colin, and I think you know that, but I'm just going to say it out loud for everybody. This is not just the South. We're having issues like this in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Chicago, Detroit, in LA. I mean, Martin Luther King goes to LA after the Watts riot, and they're like, what are you talking about nonviolence? We can't even get a job here because people are blocking us from jobs. And he starts to change his mind about, wait, we need to do more around this. We need to expand this. So this is across the country. Detroit, great. But here's the question. So did the South recognize what they were doing was unequal and didn't care? Or did they truly believe what they were doing was in the best interest of everybody? And go ahead, Tom, I'll let you answer that. And then I want to send people, and I'll send you all the links. I wanted to send you to the recording that they did at SELMA, where they interviewed people from SELMA about what had just happened, because it's so powerful and horrifying to hear the exact words of people in the community and what they thought about the civil rights movement at that time. So Tom, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to generalize too much, but I mean, I think for at that particular moment, it's 1960. So I mean, and let's even just go back to Brown in 1954. If you're even a white Southern leader, what you've been living under the entire time has been a regime where you've had the Constitution the way it's supposed to be, but the Supreme Court saying largely that it's okay. And so there's like this friction between the original promise of the amendments, how the law's been laid out on the ground. And you could imagine how you can rationalize, well, this is custom, this is how we do it. It keeps things peaceable. Because again, you're right, Kerry. Like what is King? What is King saying in a letter to from Birmingham jail? He's saying, everyone's calling me a rabble rouser. They're calling us rabble rousers, agitators. Like we're responsible for the violence. It's the fact that this system of segregation is constitutionally rotten to its core. It's constitutionally rotten to its core that's causing the violence, and we need to raise awareness. And so I don't know how exactly they self-justify. I mean, I think that might be how you self-justify, but that's a bit of the dynamics I think in play as each side is thinking through what's going on.
And next class, we'll talk about cognitive dissonance and what people do to self-justify and rationalizing like this evil. But a lot of the things that they do is that's not the way we are down here. That's not the way we live here. So there's this cognitive dissonance that's separating people in their head and saying this is the way it is. And the status quo was better for many of them. So why would they change it? So it's really kind of and that's what makes this such an important time period to study and unpack as we go through. But also to recognize it across the country as these questions and these issues. So really quickly, we go through like the amazing work of all these people leading up to the march. And then because we're going to run out of time, I want to land on the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement and hit Selma in between. So do you want to jump to?
Yeah. Let's fast forward. I think we could tick through it. So just quickly before we get to the Civil Rights Act, we have in 1963 we have the famous actions in Birmingham. So we have the Birmingham campaign, which is where Dr. King and his supporters go to Birmingham. They march. They're greeted by Bull Connor, the police commissioner, and his police officers with violent dogs and cattle prods and fire hoses. And that this, again, these images end up on national television. People are appalled. They're absolutely appalled. And then this leads to, eventually with Dr. King getting arrested for marching when a judge said that he shouldn't. And he writes his letter from a Birmingham jail. But projecting forward, we then see 1963 is a huge year, because that's also where we see the push towards the March on Washington. And why 1963? Because it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so there we see in the March on Washington, Dr. King making that powerful statement, connecting America's ideals, our founding documents, to the current moment, saying that those documents provided us with a promissory note as African Americans, that we get the full promise of freedom and equality in the Declaration and the Constitution. We haven't gotten it yet, but we have not yet given up hope. We haven't given up hope. And so the push continues, and the push eventually culminates in what you see here, Kerry, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I urge everyone, last night, the reason it's in my head, I reread the letter from Birmingham jail, and go back and read in there Dr. King's vision of equality, what he thinks is essential for America, and compare it to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because what does that Civil Rights Act of 1964 say is essential? Well, it's that we have to be treated equally in hotels, in restaurants, in our schools, in buses, in forms of transportation, in our jobs, in our government. And it writes it right there in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, giving the federal courts, giving people laying claim to federal law, giving the national government new power to enforce equality. And the Supreme Court, in a few key cases shortly after that, says, yes, that may be a completely new role, a stronger role for the national government than we've had maybe ever, but certainly in 100 years, but it's constitutional. This is Heart of Atlanta. This is Katzenbach versus McClung, the Ollie's barbecue case. And they end up justifying it through the Commerce Clause power, but I urge you, don't get too caught up on the legal technicalities. What's going on here is Congress using its powers under the Constitution to advance a new vision of equality that's connected with the civil rights movement, and the Supreme Court saying that's constitutional.
And this is the part that always shocks me, but goes back to that ebb and flow, that push and pull of equality. Then Selma happens. Then there's even more violence on activists, civil rights activists, about voting rights. John Lewis working to try to get more people registered to vote. Franny Hammer working to get more people registered to vote, and then being blocked by government officials. Oh, no, we closed the office today. I'm sorry, we can't take you in. There's a leak in the office. We can't register you to vote. And we have the culmination around Selma. And then we have the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so this is a reminder, the Civil Rights Act achieves civil rights in all of those different areas, but it does far too little on voting rights. And so we see another wave of civil rights movement activism beginning in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, pushing for a voter registration drive there. But unfortunately, it's not that successful. They are not able to register many African-American voters. We see 3 civil rights workers murdered. We see over 30 African-American churches bombed. And there's a sense that we need to take additional action. We need another big moment of solidarity that could possibly shift public opinion and really make sure that African-Americans fully have the right to vote. And this is where we culminate in Selma. This is where, what you said, Kerry, this is where the marchers are in Selma, going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is right behind Kerry. This is where John Lewis is just and many people there are they end up having to endure the most dehumanizing treatment and greatest violence. And Lewis would bear the scar of that day for the rest of his life. But again, what this does, these images on television of civil rights marchers, nonviolent marchers, being brutally beaten, shifts public opinion again, and we see it culminates in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the landmark laws in the history of the United States, and one that was unbelievably effective. Now, it does a lot of things. It gets rid of literacy tests, poll taxes, some of those Jim Crow laws. It also provides really strong constitutional medicine moving forward. What it does is it says if you are a state that, based on a formula we put together, has had a bad record on African-American voting, we're gonna get rid of your bad laws, and any new law you pass, you have to come to the national government and we have to approve it. So it completely rebalances power over voting rights from the states to the national government in these areas where there's been massive discrimination against African Americans. What's the result? We see African American voter registration in 1960 at 20%. We see it at 62% a decade later. We see between 1960 and 1970 and 1980, the number of African American office holders quadrupling. We see it double again from 1980 into 1990. And so this is a monumentally effective statute that, what does it do? Well, it does exactly what Earl Warren says it does in South Carolina versus Katzenbach. It's strong constitutional medicine. It does rebalance federalism. It does rebalance the powers between the national government and the states, but it realizes the promise written into the 15th Amendment that we would end racial discrimination in voting. It's right there in Earl Warren's statement, and he connects it very closely with the Constitution's text, its history, and says we haven't done this job over time. Congress, finally, it's been pushed to do the right thing, and the Supreme Court says, of course that's constitutional. Of course.
Okay, so Colin had some really great constitutional questions, and I'm going to loop it at the end. And I know we're wrapping up, everybody, and we're a little over, but this is a lot that we had to go through. So thank you for staying with us and joining in. Great comments in the chat. So Colin, 2 questions, and thank you for putting them in again so I could find them. All of the current justices were judges. Were they nominated, except for Kagan? But Earl Warren was political, governor of California, and others of the court were politicians as well as judges. What role do you think that played in their reading of the Constitution more broadly? And I think it's really interesting to think about Earl Warren and Earl Warren's experience and how it affected the way he read the Constitution. And I know we talk about judges looking at precedent and looking at what happens before them, but they come with lived experiences. And so how does this really kind of affect the way that they're reading the Constitution?
It's a great question, and it's constantly debated. And the thing to remember, Colin, and I'm sure you know this too, is that having justices that are all former judges is a total outlier in American history. I mean, I study the Reconstruction Court. Almost all of them held office at some point in their life. Everything from like town council upwards. So many of them were politicians. It's hard to say. I mean, like one could imagine that politicians might, like Kerry said, they bring with them a certain pragmatism, practical experience that might shape constitutional views in some way. They might be less legalistic and more big picture. I mean, I can't prove that, but I think for people who argue that we need more diversity in work experience on the court, meaning that, more people that maybe were public offenders or politicians or nonprofit leaders or what have you, that there's a value in having that range of voices and not just a bunch of, people who their informative experience were being judges. Maybe that's true. But
and that's always questionable for almost every position held in government too. Do you want somebody with different experiences, or are the limitations so tight? So good question, Colin, and we're all going to be thinking about that for a while.
One I wrestle with a lot. I mean, it's frequently on my mind.
So what role did the 19th Amendment play in the right of Black women having the right to vote? And I know we're going to get into the 19th Amendment more, but really quickly, I just thought it was a great question around like Rosa Parks' work. And did they try to assert that in addition to the 15th Amendment as the reason why Jim Crow was unconstitutional?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It will be a core of our lesson on the 19th Amendment. It's a core of our exhibit. And it's a great reminder that for African-American women, that what is the 19th Amendment's ratified in 1920, it is an additional, 45 years of fighting to have that promise realized, because their voting rights were inextricably intertwined with African-American men, and they would have to continue to fight together. They may have crossed the gender barrier, but to finally eradicate the race barrier. And so it took decades upon decades of work, and many of their old suffragist allies were there with them. Absolutely. They declared victory.
Unbelievable. And, these stories are all interlocked. So I know we break these down into topics each week, but they're so overlapping. So if you've joined us for the first time, welcome, dive in, join us again, or we can send you other materials, but they are fascinating, intertwining stories. And the only thing I want to wrap up with before we close up is just Warren also shared that, we have first ever African American and Indian American vice president today. So there's change again, change in our Constitution, change in who holds the office.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and she was, and Sonia Sotomayor was the person who swore her in.
Yeah. So fascinating day, big day in history, great conversation and great class. And yes, thank you, Kamala Harris. Thank you. Say her name. I should say her name, Mary. So thank you for reminding me. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for class. I know we ran over, but we wish we could teach this class every single day for a year. Right, Tom?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Thank you guys very much, Colin. I'm going to stop the class and then I'll pull that question in at the end.